3 years for this inquiry. Could have another pandemic by then.
I mean, these public inquiries do take a long time and they can be very difficult processes as well. I mean, we've just come to the end of the Manchester Arena public inquiry, something that I'm very familiar with of my own constituency, and that's taken many, many years. But they are difficult and they do take a long time and they do cost a lot of money. But what I would say is they do get to the heart of the matter. They do get the answers. They do get some accountability for those who've lost people, for those who are involved, for those who are on the front line. So I think they are important processes, even though they can take a long time.
Ring of steel around care homes is what we were told by the then Health Secretary Matt Hancock, one of his ministers, saying she wouldn't say that. How do you interpret what happened at the time?
Well, I actually raised this matter in Prime Minister's questions right at the start of around this time of the pandemic, because my husband's a doctor and he told me what was happening in hospitals, which was that people were being discharged to care homes without being tested, without knowing whether they had COVID or not. And I actually raised it in Prime Minister's question on Zoom when we were back on Zoom in that time. And it's quite clear, it was clear at the time, and it's clear now that people were being discharged from hospital when many of them had contracted COVID and that spread. And we had a real problem with COVID in care homes in this country. And that, I think, is one of the reasons that we saw the high death toll in this country.
Do you acknowledge,
compared to
though,
other
that the
countries.
government, there weren't enough tests, so the government just couldn't test people?
Well, there weren't enough tests, but they could have prioritised that test. They could have had a different way of dealing with that. But at the time, there was very quick discharging into care homes to kind of move people out of hospitals. So I don't think that was... I mean, look, we'll see what the inquiry's got to say. I'm not going to sit here as judge and jury when there is this very detailed work going on. But I think it's clear for all to see, those who are working in hospitals, those who are working in care homes, the families of those in care homes as well, was that there were challenges here and there was a quick spreading of COVID through care homes when there didn't need to be, I think, perhaps.
Talk to me about this young woman, relatively young woman, who has been sentenced to, the best part of 2 years, a bit more actually, in jail for taking abortion pills when her unborn baby was 32 weeks old.
I mean, it's a very complex, concerning, difficult case, and I think it really does need looking into now. The government needs to look into and come up with better guidance and clearer sentencing rules about these kind of cases, because clearly it's very difficult and, it's hard to hear about somebody feeling so in distress and so at the situation that they were, that they aborted their own child so late on in their pregnancy, which is something that obviously is wrong and not what we would want to see happen. But to sentence to such a long time somebody in that situation, we do have to look at in whose interest is that in. And that's why I think the government now should... I think it's very clear that judges and the courts don't really have the guidance they need in terms of how to deal with some of these cases, and we should look at that.
To that end, do we need to end abortion-related prosecutions?
Well, I think that's what's got to be looked at.
What do you think?
Well, I think in this particular case, it feels to me a very, very, very harsh outcome for somebody who's clearly in distress, during COVID, who's got 3 other children who are now without their mother who's in prison. It is against the law to terminate a pregnancy, so those laws do exist. In that sense, it is a crime. But I think the sanctions need to befit that situation. I think that's what needs urgent looking at. And I know my colleagues on the Labour front bench will be asking those questions.
Yeah. To that end, though, do we need to end abortion-related prosecutions?
Possibly, but there may be other circumstances. I don't know that may be appropriate for other reasons. But I think in these kind of cases, criminal prison sentences, I don't think are the right outcome.
Yeah, if you're 32 weeks pregnant, there's got to be some mental health challenges there.
Absolutely, somebody, especially in COVID, and somebody clearly who's now, very, very remorseful, and whose life has been ruined by this, and is now spending time in prison away from her own children, and that's not going to help her. It's not going to help her children, and I don't think it's particularly in the public interest in this case.
Talk to me about Just Stop Oil. They've cost the taxpayer, we're told, £4.5 million over the last 6 weeks alone. That's on top of the £7.5 million spent by forces dealing with Just Stop Oil action last year. Should you be associated with an organisation like this, even if it is indirectly, because the guy who supports you also supports Just Stop Oil?
Well, we're not associated with Just Stop Oil, and their tactics and what they're doing are completely unacceptable, and we've been very clear about that in many different ways. And we have people who are donors to the Labour Party because they support Labour Party policies, and they may give philanthropically to a wide range of other organisations. We can't be accountable for all those other organisations that all people who support the Labour Party also support, whether that be as members or whether that be as donors. But we are really clear that the tactics being used by Just Stop Oil are completely unacceptable. They are disruptive. They're counterproductive as well in terms of what they're trying to promote. And there's no question about that. And we are not associated with them.
But Labour's just voted against more protest crackdown laws, haven't you? What's your plan to curb these sort of protests?
Well,
quite quietly.
Well, as the police themselves have said, they already have the powers they need to stop these protests. Sometimes they are using them, sometimes they're not using them as effectively, but the police have themselves said they already have the powers to stop these kind of protests. What we saw yesterday was yet again the government trying to seek headlines in creating a division in Parliament. They were bringing back through what are these arcane sort of Henry VIII powers.
They're trying to stop them doing stuff like this.
Well, no, they're not. The police already have those powers. So the government tried through a bill to bring in what they were bringing in last night. Parliament, both houses of Parliament rejected that. It wasn't then able to be brought through. So they've used these other what are called sort of Henry VIII powers to kind of get round the parliamentary process. And as drafted, we think that they would have other unintended consequences. So the police already we've already passed lots of legislation over recent years around these kind of issues, and the police already have those powers.
Let me just ask you quickly before I let you go, do you believe Boris Johnson or Rishi Sunak when it comes to their spat about the House of Lords?
Well, this is just like some kind of soap opera, isn't it? I mean, you couldn't really make it up. To be honest, I find the whole thing unedifying. I mean, the fact that a former Prime Minister who is currently under investigation by the Privileges Committee ahead of the COVID inquiry, which we just discussed sort of taking place, actually even getting an honours list, I find that pretty despicable personally. So who said what to who and who should have been on that list or otherwise, I don't really care about. I don't think he should have had the list in the first place.